But most of the media focus over the summer has been on the bushfires, or more to the point, the hysterical, often deliberately misleading efforts to blame a terrible bushfire season on global warming, and in turn blame the global warming on Scott Morrison. Look at some of what's been sent out to the world.
Chief Meteorologist Ginger Zee is in Australia tonight.
Tonight, no end in sight to the unprecedented wildfires consuming Australia.
And they say the planet is dying, and Australia is right on the front lines of this climate crisis. You have the unprecedented bushfires. You have, the Great Barrier Reef drying up because of the ozone levels.
Drying up the Great Barrier Reef. So much brazenly exaggerated coverage, sometimes blatant fake news. It's been driven largely by a desire to blame the fires on climate change. More soon on that, but first I want to make a couple of things clear. This has been a shocking and tragic fire season, and it is far from done with just yet. We all have great empathy, of course, for the victims and gratitude and admiration for the firefighters, especially those who've paid the ultimate price. The news over the summer has been so horrible there was no excuse to exaggerate it. Before we get to the criticism also, let me hand out some more praise. The dozens of journalists, photographers and camera operators who have reported from the front lines. They've worked long hours in dangerous conditions, experiencing torment and trauma. It's physically and emotionally overwhelming work, and it's vital. So well done to them. And also, let's recognise the crucial role of media in broadcasting fire warnings. The ABC, especially as the national broadcaster, is central in keeping people up to date.
Tourists have been told to leave a massive 14,000 square kilometre area between Nowra and the Victorian border.
Sky News and others do a sterling job on this too, but the ABC reaches every corner of the nation, and credit where it's due. Now for the bad news. The ABC, along with other Green left media, have really let us down like never before with commentary and political posturing around the fires. From the start, activists and politicians have been trying to fit up climate change for the bushfires, and there's been an eagerness to apportion party political blame too. Much of the media has just amplified this narrative.
What was the situation with controlled burning, and how big a role has climate change played in all of this?
Yeah, look, that's a really good point, and something that Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison has just been heavily criticised for his inaction on climate change, his government's inaction on climate change. There are so many climate change deniers here in Australia. We are experiencing the worst fire season on record. On top of that, Rosemary, we are also experiencing here in Australia the worst drought. Years-long drought. So you have exceptionally dry conditions. This fire season began so much earlier than what it normally begins. This has been going on now for months, and we are only in January. These hot, dry conditions will continue for several more months. So there is no end in sight.
So much reporting has been based not on facts and evidence, but just repeating rhetoric from climate activists and Green politicians.
It's a tragic failure of leadership, and of course we know sitting underneath these unprecedented fires is the issue of dangerous climate change. We've got a Prime Minister who continues to lobby for the coal industry. We know that coal is the single biggest cause of climate change. We know that these fires are fuelled by climate change.
Even when rain kept many climate protesters at home, the media didn't lose their enthusiasm.
Thousands posted their support online, but how many have actually turned up?
Well, Alicia, despite the cool change and the pouring rain, it has been a fairly significant turnout. 15,000 people registered their interest. Now, there may not be that many people here, but it's certainly in the hundreds, if not more than 1,000 people that have gathered. They're here to demonstrate or call for action on climate change in response to the bushfire disaster. Now, this comes despite pleas from top officers, top police, saying please hold off on this protest, given that the resources, the pressure on resources that it will come to bear.
Overseas, Australia was denounced, including by the BBC, who ran former Fire Commissioner Greg Mullins unquestioningly from November, without even mentioning he was a current climate change activist.
In this article, he says, if anyone tells you this is part of a normal cycle or we've had fires like this before, smile politely, and walk away because they don't know what they're talking about. Also relevant to this is that Australia is the world's largest coal exporter, and according to the UN, it's not on track to meet its commitments under the Paris Climate Change Accord.
Did I detect a menacing hint that we were getting what we deserved? And is this a similar insinuation?
In Australia, you see a country that has an absolutely climate change denying prime minister that has now been terribly hit by the impact of climate change.
Cynical stuff, to be sure, but plenty joined in at home, including former prime ministers settling old political scores.
Here in Australia, we are in the front line of the consequences of climate change, and the question many Australians ask, and the question the world asks, is why is Australia as a nation not also in the front line of taking action to address climate change and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions?
You'd hardly know that Scott Morrison's emissions reduction target, the Paris Agreement emissions reduction target, is exactly the same one that Malcolm Turnbull had adopted as well, would you? The science says a warming climate and changing rain patterns will make high-risk fire days more common. But of course, because we've often faced horrendous fire conditions over millennia, let alone after European settlement, the only way to pin these bushfires on global warming was to claim they were the worst we've ever had. Back in November, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service chief made a factual and relevant statement about the unprecedented number of dangerous fires in his state on that day.
Looking at the board here this afternoon, to have 17 fires concurrently burning at emergency warning alert level is without precedent here in New South Wales. We've simply never had this number of fires burning at EW at the same time.
From that time on, the word unprecedented was used liberally, often wrongly, here and overseas to describe all fires and the national situation.
Recap, today's fires are unprecedented. Fires in Queensland earlier this year were unprecedented. Townsville flood was unprecedented. The Central Queensland fires last year were unprecedented. This is his tweet. The drought is unprecedented. It is an emergency.
Pete, this really is unprecedented.
An unprecedented 16 emergency bushfire warnings are in place.
The government has declared an unprecedented 7-day state of emergency.
Yes, it's been unprecedented, the conditions we've seen here on the mid-north coast today, the worst in at least 20 years.
Tonight, no end in sight to the unprecedented wildfires consuming Australia.
The district has been blowtorched by an unprecedented event,
which have created dry, unprecedented conditions.
Assisting with planning, logistics and operations in reining in this unprecedented blaze.
The heat of this unprecedented wildfire is what Angeles firefighters will be facing early next week.
The rhetoric convinced many, so that what was plainly untrue was shared with the world as fact.
Australia is well used to bushfires, but this extremity, this intensity, this degree, Australia has not seen before, and these are the worst in living memory.
Well, worst ever is plainly untrue, and even worst in living memory is just wrong too. When we've seen the Black Saturday fires of 2009 kill 173 people in Victoria, and the Ash Wednesday fires of 1983 kill 75 people across South Australia and Victoria. Other horror seasons stretch back over the decades and the centuries. Bjorn Longborg of the Copenhagen Consensus Centre has also shown how there are vast areas of Australia burned by bushfire every year, and that so far this season, rather than the largest ever, it's below average. This includes fires burning, of course, in remote areas, but over this season too, much of the area burned has been remote national parks and forests left to burn before flaring up and escaping containment lines. Still, the fires have been the worst in New South Wales, and the threat continues. But the exaggerations also continue. Look at this from the Washington Post. The piece focuses emotively on koalas and other wildlife, and again the fires are described as the largest in the nation's history. Standard untruths now, the accepted wisdom. But to fully appreciate the misinformation, have a look at this sentence. It is unclear here whether the eucalyptus forest will recover, almost certainly not to the same near ubiquitous pre-fire extent. Dear oh dear, anyone with the most basic understanding of our bushland ecology knows that these sclerophyll forests have evolved to rely on fire for their very rejuvenation. The eucalypts will bounce back and propagate better than ever. So will the acacias, hakeas, banksias. The xanthorrhoeas will reshoot and flower. It's already underway. Nature's recovery from fire in this continent is an ancient and precious cycle that has the phoenix rising from the ashes. But I guess this doesn't fit the media narrative, does it? Politics has been all over the coverage, and here too there's been exaggeration and misinformation. Here's the BBC talking to Sydney Morning Herald journalist Latika Burke.
Is it fair to say that the very existence of climate change is still an active debate in Australia?
Yes, it's been a very ferocious debate in Australia for about the last decade, and it's been split largely down this idea that the climate science is something that can be questioned. Climate change, if it is happening at all, is not the fault of human activity. And then on the other side, this belief that we should have been acting a lot earlier to introduce carbon trading schemes, something that was tried and failed and a government was defeated over. And the other idea that we should also be transitioning our very fossil fuel dependent economy to renewables. Now, so far, those debates have not really had any outcome. It's continued to split the major two parties in Australia, and as we just saw in your excellent summation, with no resolution except what we're seeing this summer, and that's a catastrophic weather event.
The politics led to the fires. Now, we know that some people, some scientists, some commentators, even politicians challenge the dominant scientific views on climate. But to suggest this is the core of the national political divide in Australia is clearly untrue. Both major parties accept the science and the need for multilateral action. The only points of disagreement are the level of the emissions reductions targets and the methods for achieving them. But again, such complexities seem to be too troublesome for many in the media. They prefer a false dichotomy, action versus inaction, or science versus denial. This is the first time we've seen such a tragedy co-opted into a political and ideological debate. It's ugly. With the loss of human life and destruction of treasured homes and farms used to push a climate change political message, it represents a new low in political and media advocacy.